Hello and welcome to another episode of the Chronicles of Chase. In today's episode, the second short story time, Lyra the Nephthysian, will be read aloud while assorted games on the PS5 play in the background. These short story times are one-shot stories meant to be anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour long. Today's story was previewed shortly on this YouTube and in a more in-depth way on the Chronicles of Chase podcast's second episode, which contains the second half of the Nalteethkanet story. If you haven't checked out that podcast, please do. It is available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And as always, if you like what you hear, please like and subscribe. Now, without further ado, Lyra the Nephthysian. The planet of Nephthesia has been inhabited by human beings for tens of thousands of years. The exodus from the dying Earth had sent them scattering across the universe. They had mustered the planet's last resources for the journey, draining fuel reserves and packing spaceships full of all the supplies and people they could carry. The Nepthesians had come from a landmass called America. Besides the fact that the name applied to multiple parts of the landmass, and that one part was united at one point and disunited shortly before the Exodus, was all that they knew. Humanity had collaborated insofar as building the crafts like the one that had brought the Nepthesians to their distant home. But travel and destinations were guarded closely, state secrets of the highest order. No two crafts had planned to exodus to other planets alongside each other. The trust required for such a move was severely lacking. And so, humanity persisted in these distant reaches of the galaxy, segmented and disconnected. The Nepthesian ship had made landing after 3 generations on board the craft. Only 3 of the original inhabitants of Earth, all in their late 90s, had survived to step onto the soil of Nephthesia. Statues were erected, and the ship was turned into a standing museum. Even now, statues remain standing sentry outside the vine-covered, melting into the scenery spacecraft that had brought them there so long ago. It stood as a monument to the precipitous heights that human innovation and cooperation could reach, heights that felt like past generations taunting the mostly agrarian Nepthesians. Lyra is the janitor for the current diviner, a role of enchanting and sorcery that existed on Nephthesia since about 1,000 years after landing. The humans who had first landed here had set up an apprentice system, training new generations under the old. The system had maintained a bridge of knowledge from Nephthesia all the way back to the humans who had originated these schools of thought back on Earth. But the bridge had started crumbling nearly as soon as they had left. The distrust of the humans as they evacuated the dying planet had doomed Nephthesia, as it had other satellite colonies. With each subsequent generation, the planet became more and more disconnected from the tendrils of knowledge that had sustained societies until not much was left, besides the name of their former home and basic arithmetic. Chemistry, physics, history, calculus, geometry, all fell by the wayside, and basic human knowledge had to be rediscovered, reworked. About 2,000 solstice cycles after their first landing, the new way that these Nepthesians told time on their strange planet, a basic theory of gravity using Nepthesia's physics was reworked, and scientific endeavors began to look up, but all of that was stopped by the diviner and his line. It is said that the diviner's line were librarians in the old apprentice system. They maintained the somewhat substantial, at one point, collection of books on Nephthesia, and they had access to the Holy Scripture. The first diviner supposedly ran for the position of High Council, an outdated term of the First Nepthesian Order, on a platform of interplanetary literacy, cross-discipline training, a radical reform system to try to curb the learning loss on the planet. When he reached the office of High Council, though, this position was turned on its head. Nephthesians were still allowed the morsels of knowledge they'd been able to glean from the millennia of learning, but dark times had followed after the Diviner dynasty had commenced. Book burnings were rampant in the first few millennia, until most of the books that had been carefully procured by the humans who had left Earth had been purged from the face of the planet. Subsequent pushes to burn books happened through the many diviners whose rule followed those who purged knowledge from the colony, but many of those burnings were populated by pamphlets of propaganda a nefarious influence printed by the past diviners, rulers whose styles and text had been deemed the new sacrilege worthy of burning. Almost every single text from Earth had gone by the wayside long ago. Except, that is, the diviners' holy scripture. It was whispered across the planet and most loudly in the halls which Lyra now cleans, that the line of the diviners drew their strength and power from this holiest of holy texts. It was deemed by the first diviner, and every one that has come since, as the only text worthy of saving, the text above all other texts. Its very existence necessitated, nay demanded, the other text's destruction. Lyra and all other Nephthysians had known this fact since before they could walk. All Nepthesians' literacy, since the first few diviners, has relied solely upon the official communique of the planet, curated carefully by the diviner and a select team of readers, sanctioned to lay eyes on the Holy Scripture. Lyra is in the room with it now, a skylight built into the ceiling which allows perpetual sunlight to train upon its cover. It lies under tinted glass, protecting its cover and the pages within from the natural light, upon a podium built of Nepthesian marble. The obelisk rises nearly 2 quinta-units from the ground, angular and regal. Lyra is dusting the lower steps that lead to the dais under which it is read. She is among the select few on the planet's surface whose biometric data even allows her in this room, much less past the point she is about to breach. She looks left, then right, always worried about the auto-defenses built into the room accidentally triggering, not recognizing her official status. How many times had she cleaned the flesh and blood of Nepthesians, large and small, from all corners of the planet, off these steps, from these walls, in the tomb within which the Holy Scripture was held. Having done her obligatory, worthless check of the area, she takes her first step up the staircase toward the podium, gritting her teeth and listening for the blaster portal's mechanical, deathly clank. Not hearing it, she continues up the steps, thankful that she only needs to dust the case and perform her conditioning routines on the scripture today. She wasn't sure why Nepthesians kept doubting the diviner's defenses, kept braving the room to try and touch the Holy Scripture and know what secrets it held within. But then again, she thinks, they don't all have the same access to the scripture that I do, and they don't clean the mess of remains from the room each time someone who is not a reader or the diviner dares enter and try to summit the scripture's dais. There was a time, growing up as a child destined for this position of royal janitorial work, that she desired to be a reader. Every child on Nephthesia holds similar desires at one point in their upbringing, and near every child has the same feeling Lyra did when they discover that readers are only allowed to serve for 8 solstice cycles before the diviner invites them to a final dinner, poisons them, and enshrines their replacement. The celibacy was just the cherry on top of sacrifice, nothing compared to the final offering one must give, and surely not the end-all be-all sacrifice readers make, as all children had been led to believe before this discovery. Lyra shudders as she thinks of the fate of the many, many readers who have existed throughout the planet's ill-fated history. The bodies could carpet the planet's surface 5 times over. And for what? A privilege Lyra held so many days out of the year, save holidays and weekends, which she gave so much thanks for? She couldn't hardly fathom seeking the honor of being a reader. Sure, some of the families saw the endeavor as one that held glory. They thought it bestowed great esteem and distinction upon their lines by offering such unbroken chains of readers, generation after generation. Lyra had heard many accounts from the disgraced class of readers who had refused, in bars outside the palace throughout the years, mainly the Nepthesian. Her heart always ached for these men and women. For one, she knew they were hours, maybe days if they were lucky, away from the diviner's dungeons and re-education programs. But she also couldn't help but empathize with such an impossible situation. Everyone around you expects you to become a reader. The diviner expects you to become a reader. And then give up your life for it? Lyra cannot see how families like the O'Briens and Tors were able to carry on generations of readers that now span millennia, hundreds of diviners and thousands of readers. For what? She thinks as she looks down at the cover, applying light amounts of oil to the leather, and rubbing it in gently with her cloth, caressing the spine and passing the rag over the back of the cover. There was one privilege these readers enjoyed which Lyra could never bring herself to test. She thinks about it again as she looks down at the cover of the book. Me Ryam Weebster Dictionary, it says. She always feels the desire, overwhelming in some regards, to crack the cover open, but she always remembers the defense systems behind her, so omnipresent in her mind as they are now, placing the scripture back onto its podium without acting on her desires. Sometimes she thinks, as she does right now, well, how would they know that I had opened it? Rationalizing that the defenses had only been activated on people who enter the room or tread upon the stairs when they should not. She is allowed to hold the scripture. How would the defenses know if she had opened it? And wouldn't their activation compromise the text anyway? Before she knows what she is doing, she has vaulted back up the steps, grabbed the scripture, and opened its pages. When she sees what she has done, she gasps, darting her eyes up from the forbidden pages toward the walls, ears pricked to the highest tension, listening for an activation of the defenses. But they don't come. Her mind scrambles as she flips through the pages, recognizing some words as they flutter before her eyes. Divine, subservient, submission. But others look foreign to her, completely outside the lexicon that had been allowed to Nephthysians for so long. Freedom, free will, justice, revolution. Many of these words had caught her eye due to the black ink that had redacted access to their meaning. Even in the scripture there's forbidden knowledge, she thinks, her mind running at a nauseating pace. Action, she thinks again, rushing down the dais and towards the door. Then her heart stops as she teeters on the precipice, scanning behind her once again for an activation of the defense systems. How had she been allowed to open the text, to take it from the dais, down the steps, and to the door? She wasn't sure. But this progress fills her with strength, sends wind into the sails of this newfound rebellious action that her meager janitorial self had dared to take. She dangles the text outside the door, letting it pass over the threshold whose breaching had led to so many ends. The corner of the tome swings through the doorway, Lyra holding it taut at 90 degrees. She looks out, from the doorway to the left, then to the right, scanning wildly for any sign of guards, of an alarm being triggered. Nothing. She takes a deep breath, a sweat bead trickling from her hair down the nape of her neck. Slowly, carefully, at a pace and level of concentration unbeknownst to her until this moment, Lyra edges her hand over the threshold, then past it, until her entire hand lies holding the book outside of the door, wrist hovering over the threshold, as the rest of her wary body trembles, waits, watches on the other side. She takes a few deep breaths in this position, hopes that her inexact science has been test enough, then steels herself and leaps over the door's edge. The automatic seal shutting behind her makes her jump, turning towards what she thinks, knows, will be her end. But it is only the thick metal doors, red, purple, and gold, with their stark warning of death and destruction to all who enter, save the diviners and the readers. Lyra had often thought, as she entered the tomb/sanctuary with trepidation, that it would do so much to quell the cleaner anxiety if they had been included in this message. But she supposed on these occasions that cleaners' anxieties were much like cleaners themselves, not nearly important enough for an inscription, for care or thought of any kind. Her heart leaps with hope as she looks at these doors once again, hoping against hope that this oversight on the diviner's part, this decision to ignore cleaners, will save her now. She opens the top of her jumpsuit, dropping the tome into her chest and letting it fall to rest at her cinched waist. From here, Lyra's actions become fluid, precise, almost foreign to her, as her body takes over. She slices through the servants' hallways, back alleys, and tunnels within walls that allow the diviner's help to remain mostly hidden as they serve out his desires, and allow Lyra to stay hidden as she flees with the scripture. She keeps her cleaning equipment by her side, clinging to it like a life preserver in a rough sea, her knuckles white as they clutch the bucket handle, the duster. 3 times, other servants pass her in the quarters on the way to the cleaner's lockers. 3 times she holds her cleaning equipment slightly aloft, directly in front of her stomach. The scripture, as she averts her eyes, hugs the wall, and hurries along her way. 3 times she checks behind her, nerves jumping out of control in her mind and gut, as her eyes desperately search for the watchful, following glare of one of the servants, somehow having spotted the outline of the only book on Nephthesia within her uniform. 3 times her scattered mind had to accept the nothingness, the empty hallway which stares back at her as her feet marshals her forward, down and through into the cleaner's lockers, which she now stands. Her only co-worker, Clarice, stands behind her, readying herself for her shift. She had glanced up at Lyra in surprise when she entered, the two muttering curt greetings to each other as they passed. Lyra now watches her reflection intently, knowing the greetings will not be the end of it. She's nearly 30 minutes early, a fact that Clarice will not allow to go undiscussed. The inevitable broaching of the subject comes. "Why you out so early?" Clarice asks, turning from her locker. Lyra sees an inquisitive eyebrow raised in the reflection as she turns to face her, sweat pouring down the river that has been grooved on the back of her neck and into her shirt. She can hear her heartbeat in her ears, but she tries to remain calm. "Anybody get creamed in the tomb today?" Clarice adds, eyebrows still dangling atop her forehead. Lyra can feel the power play in the words. They both know no dignitaries were scheduled to be taken by the scripture room today. Why these schedulings still existed, given the result each time, Lyra couldn't say. Maybe it was a fear tactic? Blast a dignitary every couple of weeks and people remain in awe of the scripture, of its untouchability. Anyway, with no scheduled visits, if anyone had been blasted, it would be big news in the palace. Some random event that shouldn't have happened, surely involving some crazed mad dash through multiple sectors and past multitudes of guards. If Lyra were to lie about something like this, she would be found out in minutes, maybe even seconds, after Clarice had exited the room from this conversation. She chooses what feels like her only option. "No, just feeling a little under the weather today. Insomnia's been plaguing me, haven't slept hardly a wink all week," Lyra says, shrugging and hoping that Clarice hasn't noticed her reticence to get undressed, her still unshelved cleaning supplies clutched in her grasp that cover the scripture in her jumpsuit. Clarice's eyebrows remain cocked, maybe even traveling further up her face, if this is possible. Lyra knows she has given a risky answer. Not near as risky as her alternative, though, she thinks. "Well, don't make a habit of it, or they'll make me head cleaner," Clarice says with a wry grin and a chuckle, reaching across the bench between them to jostle Lyra's shoulders. The shove feels menacing, and the comment earnest, but Lyra smiles back, mustering the best chuckle she can before saying, "I won't, Clarice. Trust me, I won't." Satisfied, Clarice turns back towards her locker, gathers her cleaning supplies, and exits the room in one swift motion. Lyra is stunned for a few seconds, staring off into space at Clarice's closed locker before she snaps herself out of it, changes quickly, stuffing the scripture to the bottom of her work bag wrapped in her jumpsuit. She hopes if anyone stops her on her way out, she can tell them she's taken the jumpsuit home for a cleaning, and hope they don't reach out and touch it. She hurries quickly from the cleaner's lockers toward the workers' exit from the palace. When she is 100 quinta units out from the door, she hears a commotion behind her. Shouting, crashing, then more shouting that sounds like Clarice. Lyra quickens her pace to an all-out sprint, putting every ounce of energy in her body into getting to the door. When she's 20 quinta units out, Clarice and 2 palace guards come crashing through the cleaner's locker door at the end of the hall. Lyra leaps and bounds, closing the gap and opening the exit door just as the lockdown lights illuminate the hallway behind her. The automatic lock on the door she pushes out into the alley blasts 3 enormous deadbolts from within. Lyra turns and watches as Clarice and the palace guards try to close the impossible distance before the door shuts, its deadbolts retracting then re-engaging. Faint pounds from within come seconds later, sending Lyra back into her maximum speed flight from the palace grounds. Her feet ferry her left, then right, then left again, up and down snaking alleyways, and always away from the central compound. As she runs past shopkeepers' stalls, back door exits to tenement buildings, an old woman hanging her laundry out to dry, she is harangued by official announcements that seem to be blasting out from the sky above. "A lockdown order has been declared. Please find shelter and stay there. By decree of the diviner. A lockdown order has been declared. Please find shelter and stay there. By decree of... Lyra's feet continue pushing her forward as the alleyways begin to clear out. Shouldn't she be ducking in somewhere, finding shelter, like the announcements keep saying? She thinks to herself. Being the last one out during a lockdown would be a death sentence. But they'll be searching the structures closest to the palace first, her brain retorts as she twists around a corner and down a large flight of stairs. They want you to panic, she thinks, leaping off the fourth step up and landing on the cobblestones below. Besides, her brain had just caught up with her feet. She knew where she was going. She was only a block away. Lyra bursts out of the alleyway and onto the near, empty street. Before her, like a holy sight to a pilgrim, the Nephthysian stands, stooped, leaning, and grubby. Her friend and sometime lover, Panagy, the gruff bartender and owner of the Nephthysian, is just swinging the front door closed. His keys dangle from the deadbolt, and he swats them in surprise, jumping at the sight of Lyra. He checks his watch, looking back up at her with the same inquisitive look that Clarice had worn. Thankfully, unlike Clarice, he leaves it alone, at least for the time being. Instead yelling, "Well, come on, Lyra, get your ass in here," and clapping her hard on her shoulders as she enters the bar. He locks the front door behind her, the deadbolt giving a satisfying click as the lockdown alarms are dulled. Lyra makes her way through the room, saying hello to a few regulars she recognizes on the way. Shortly after arrival on the planet, the discovery of Huron root, a smokable plant that could also be brewed into an ale, had set the society up from many establishments like Panagy's Nephthysian. Smoky rooms filled with patrons so mellow, half of them were lulling in and out of sleep, were a staple throughout the history of the planet, both before and during the diviner era. But the Huron root could also beget violent outbursts, passionate pleas from Nephthysians whose hearts and brains could not, under the influence, continue to lie or speak false truths. These outbursts were dangerous for the intoxicated, though they usually held no such peril for those around them, unless they began to voice agreement for the treasonous one's outburst. Lyra had often wondered, while watching these outbursts, why one would inebriate themselves so, drinking and smoking until they were nearly passed out, when they knew they had planetary secrets within their mind. Had they simply reached a breaking point, where they actually wanted to let the treasonous thoughts spill out and flow forth? Was the Huron root just a segue to their destruction? Surely, but could it also be a gateway to their deliverance? The room is quite full, Lyra thinks as she makes her way towards Panagy's office behind the bar, rubbing shoulders and twisting her body this way and that to shuffle around all the people. They couldn't have all been here imbibing when the lockdown started, she thinks, scanning the room and counting at least 8 minors. The smoke in the room is particularly light for such a packed bar. As her eyes scan, her body shifting and trudging slowly through the harangue of people, she notices eyes, looking back at her. Men's eyes, women's eyes, even the children's, all seem to be trained on her bag. She suddenly remembers the scripture and clutches the bag close to her chest with her left arm as she gently shoves the last few patrons out of the way with her right and slides behind the bar. She tries to keep her eyes down, shuffling quickly towards the office door. As she grasps the handle, Lyra turns back to steal one last glance at the room. All seems normal, at least normal for a lockdown to her eyes. Groups cluster together and talk while people glance nervously towards the door, waiting for the all-clear to be called. That must have been why they were looking at me, Lyra thinks to herself as she slips into the office, locks the door and flops down in Panagy's chair, letting the bag drop to the floor beside her. Her heart thumps in her ears as the slightest tinge of fatigue creeps into her legs. Most of it is kept at bay by the adrenaline that thunders through her body, echoing to every corner, and boomeranging back to her brain. The scripture, she thinks, almost madly, scrambling to the floor to her knees and scrabbling at the fasteners of her bag. Once open, she tries to slow down, unwrapping it as gently as she can. The aged, still freshly oiled cover looks back at her. She thinks she hears a commotion from the main room outside the door, yelling and shouting that dies down quickly. Still, she wraps the last layer of her jumpsuit back over the cover, refastens the bag, and goes to the door, placing her head on the heavy Nephthysian oak just as a sharp rap knocks the other side. Her nerves do a quick somersault before she can compose herself, unlock the door, and crack it open, her foot resting on the floor behind it. Damn it, Lyra, this is my office, isn't it? Panagy's gruff voice comes from the other side of the crevice, his eyes glaring through at her. She lets her foot relax, and Panagy swings the door open and comes barreling into the office. After he has cleared the threshold, Lyra slams the door shut and locks it back before turning around. Panagy stares back, slightly aghast. What? It's a lockdown, and I thought I heard something out there. What was that? She says, shrugging her shoulders. Panagy mimics her, sighing. You know people in a lockdown, especially at the end of most of their work days. His face turns into a wolfish grin, and Lyra knows the stupid comment that will come next. I was hoping some of them might want some Haran root, but alas. He looks at her, a gesture smile plastered on his face, like she hasn't heard the same joke every lockdown they'd spent together at the Nephthysian since he took over from his father. Her stare back must be icy, because Panagy almost immediately goes on the defensive, throwing his hands up as he says, What? Not funny? Lyra tries to keep it from happening, but she cannot. Not while Panagy talks blithe nothings and cracks the same tired old jokes. She can't keep her eyes from straying every couple of seconds, holding vigil over her bag, over the scripture. Panagy hasn't noticed yet, too focused on the lockdown, on getting Lyra in on his jokes, but it's only a matter of time. He looks back at her, brows slightly furrowed, when her gaze returns to him once more. Then he does it. Lyra knew the issue would be forced. She knew it would come out like this. He reaches for his collar, loosening the clasp that sits there before he brings the lapel down in one smooth motion. The words leap from Lyra's throat, unable to contain them. No, no, no. Stop, Panagy, please. I haven't come here for that. His hands stop halfway down his torso, then return back to his throat, redoing the clasp. What have you come here for, then? He says, adding quickly, It's not that there aren't other reasons to come here. Surely you have a busy life, many reasons to be anywhere, many reasons to be at the Nephthysian. I just thought, because of the lockdown and... Here he trails off, glancing up and down quickly between Lyra and his feet before jumping back in rapid fire. Maybe you would like some Haran root? Or to talk? What's going on, Lyra? Panagy finishes, thankfully, but the questions he stops upon fill her with dread. Had she come here to talk? What was going on? She glances again towards her bag, toward the hidden scripture, and this time Panagy stares far more knowing when she looks back at him. Now he glances at the bag, making her jump, the words coming out stilted and nervy. No, Panagy, please. I did come here to talk to you. You're right about that. And there is something going on. She stops again, looking at the bag longer this time. I need you to promise me, she says, looking back his way, that you won't tell anyone. I need you to put it on your mother's grave tree. The last demand startles Panagy. Oaths upon a loved one's grave tree could be offered on Nephthesia, but they were never supposed to be demanded of another. What is going on, Lyra? He says, his voice harder this time. Swear it, Panagy. I swear it, he says flatly. Lyra looks back, waiting. They sit in silence for a moment before Panagy gives an exasperated sigh, then says, I swear it on my mother's grave tree, Lyra. May the diviner strike me dead if I am lying. The last addition, completely unasked for, makes Lyra's blood run cold. She has gotten her oath, though she should not have asked for it. She has to share now. She blows the heavy Nephthysian air from her lungs, slow, leaning down and sliding her bag in front of her feet. As she uncovers the scripture, folding her jumpsuit back, Panagy gasps. She looks back up at him and sees a mask of pure horror plastered on his features. He begins recoiling, pushing his chair back from the bag in a fearful creep towards the wall. His gaze is still locked on the scripture in the bag, the gasp having stopped Lyra's motion of taking it out. She folds the jumpsuit back over the cover and launches into her best explanation. You know how I cleaned the tomb, the sanctuary, he chastens in a barely audible voice. Okay, the sanctuary. If you cleaned it, you'd call it a tomb too. Anyway, I clean the sanctuary every day. I see what every single non-reader has sacrificed just for a glimpse at the scripture. I see each and every reader go to their final meal, replaced by a fresh-faced teen doomed to the same fate in a few short solstice cycles. I see the diviner, holding his book and knowledge of it over all of us. We deserve to read it too. So you stole it? Panagy says, finally breaking his gaze from the tome and glaring back at Lyra. And what was your grand plan after that? He pauses, his eyes darting left and right as his brain processes. This lockdown, it's for you, and you brought the diviner's stolen holy scripture to the Nephthysian. To me? Anger rises in his face like mineral water in a Nephthysian geyser, sending crimson flushing his features like river water in a delta floodplain. She stammers, trying to get the words out. It's not like that, Panagy. I didn't come here on purpose. I was just running, trying to get away. Then I looked up and I was around the corner. I never wanted you involved in this. I don't even really know what I was doing. But now that it's out of the palace, she pauses, looking down at the scripture. We have to let the people know. The more people who read it before they take it back, the more power we have. The more people who read it? He says curtly, glancing back at her. Have you lost your mind? Lyra clutches the bag's handles closer, making it jump slightly off the ground. Panagy jumps up at the sight of her sudden movement, training his large frame between her and the door. Lyra's eyes narrow, while one hand clasps the bag back shut. Panagy, please, she starts again, this time with more conviction. We cannot turn it in without dooming me to certain death. You'd be killing me, giving it back. You already did that the moment you took it out of the palace. I'm just trying to save my business, my standing in this city, my life, damn it. Now give me the Holy Scripture, Lyra. Please. She clutches the bag tighter. His shoulders tense, and his eyes glance toward his desk. I won't ask again, Lyra. The diviner's royal guards are already on their way. She looks toward the desk, just now noticing the faint red glow coming every few seconds from underneath it. Her mind scrambles through all the memories she had of readers who have refused, infidels and other treasonous patrons of the Nephthysian, so lost in the haze of the Haran route that they could not see that they were dooming themselves. But how? Who had been the witness to these linguistic crimes? The diviner's eyes and ears. She had always assumed it was the secret police that the regime talked so much about. The joke was that the secret was in name only, making an appearance in nearly every week's communique from the diviner. The truth dawns on her as she turns back towards Panagy. She had seen this light before, had ignored the nagging feeling that had almost always preempted one of these snatches by the royal guard. It had been Panagy all along. And now he had alerted them about her presence, the scripture's presence, in the Nephthysian. She charges him in a blind rage, sending a knee into his midsection and punching him hard across the chin as he falls. Panagy stumbles back, briefly stunned, and Lyra shoots the gap over his body, unlocking the deadbolt and pushing the door open in one fell swoop. She yanks the bag hard over Panagy's body, but he reaches out and grabs one of the straps, holding fast. She can feel herself losing the tug-of-war that has commenced, and acts quickly. Her left arm darts down, snagging the clasp with it. As the bag heaves into Panagy's grip, his two-arm strength vastly outpacing her one, Lyra snags the scripture wrapped in her jumpsuit with her left hand and tucks it into her ribs. She slams the door shut behind her, pushing madly past the crowd that has now breached the bar area. The entire bar is looking at her, having watched the whole struggle, and some people reach out and grab at the wrapped scripture. Lyra smacks the hands away, but they keep coming. She's about halfway through the crowd when Panagy crashes through the office door and screams to the bar, "Stop that woman!" Hands reach out, this time grasping Lyra's shoulders and arms, and she launches into a desperate speech as they do. "Please, no!" she starts, shaking some hands off with the sheer force of her words. "I am a cleaner for the diviner. I have something you all may like to see, to learn from." The group around her steps back a few feet, forming a solid ring around her. Panagy continues blustering behind the bar, but the people have now turned to stop him. Someone tells him to shut up, and he does. Whispers run through the crowd as everyone turns to look at Lyra. "You know that my duty as a cleaner is to cleanse the tomb, the sanctuary, of the remains of every Nephthysian to try the oh-so-treasonous act of reading from the scripture. I have done this duty for a countless number of deaths, so needless and so many. She trails off. The whispers have died down, and the room listens with rapt attention. A baby cries out once, but quickly quiets to murmuring as it looks around at the mute adults that surround it. What is so precious, so worthy of protection in this scripture? What do the diviner and his readers know that we do not? At this, she lets the flap of her jumpsuit fall, revealing the cover of the scripture. The room gasps, much as Panagy did when he beheld its cover. Some people make the sign of the diviner over themselves and turn away. "We can know now," Lyra says, trying to push through the shifting atmosphere. She unwraps the scripture entirely, holding it with both hands over her head as she continues. So many people have died for the knowledge which we could possess now. Readers who saw these pages, and dignitaries who didn't get within a quintillion of its pages. All we have to do is open it and read. More people turn away. The grumbling of the crowd raises to a fervent pitch, making Lyra pull the scripture back down to her bosom. Just as she does, a man near the front of the ring around her reaches out and grabs it by the spine. "You're right, let's read it. Give it here so I can." Lyra pulls back on the book, her grip loosening. She cannot rip the only book left on Nephthesia. She did not steal it to destroy it. Another man reaches out, grasping the tome opposite the other man's grip on the spine, and Lyra feels the book slipping away. The first man steps up onto an adjacent table, stooping so he doesn't crack his head on the ceiling. He carries the scripture with him, roughly pulling it up. Lyra cringes, knowing the binding could give out at any moment. When he opens the book, he laughs, turning its pages to the crowd. "It's been drawn in, ruined. Even the scripture, this holiest of holy books, has not been allowed to exist." The crowd boos and jeers as Lyra helplessly tries to push through them towards the table. They've formed a line around the thief's table and hold her well at bay. She screams, "Please, give it back, please." But it is lost in the deafening din in the bar. "I say we burn it," the man on the table bellows. Nearly 2/3 of the bar roars their approval, banging on tables and stamping their feet. The children in the room have been all but forgotten, and many of them join in with their parents, mimicking whatever they see. The other third of the bar, the ones who had turned at the sight of the scripture, now turn back toward the man on the table. They begin to push through the supporters of the book burning who surround them, working in groups of 5 or 6 and making considerably more progress than Lyra. "Burn it before they have a chance to take it back," the man on the table adds, swelling his supporters. "Even now they try to reclaim it, to take it back for their beloved diviner." The man points out the 2 or 3 groups, egging his supporters into pushing the loyalists back. Lyra watches it all, helpless to do anything but. Her eyes move back to the scripture, flailing wildly in the man's hands. As its pages cross the torchlight behind them, she swears she can see the words through the censor bars on the page. "Wait, please. We might still be able to read it," she screams with every ounce of effort left in her body. To her surprise, the room stops, turning towards her. Some murmurs in the crowd sound like they may be assenting, fracturing into a third faction that wanted to do what Lyra wanted to do, to save the scripture and have it be read. Then, the knock comes at the door. It is hard, foreboding, ominous. The announcement, "This is the Royal Guard. Open this door immediately," sends the room back into a frenzy. The fabled third faction that Lyra had hoped for disappears as bar patrons scream, "Burn it," and "Give it back," and go at each other's throats. The man on the table picks up the torch on the wall behind him, sending the people around him into raucous cheers. The loyalists have made serious headway, and the chants of burn it, now come from the people who are mostly behind them. The door bursts open, royal guards armed with a battering ram crashing through, and the man on the table sets the scripture down, pages open, and sets the torch to rest between them. It goes up like kindling soaked in fire starter, taking the table with it into the blaze just after the man scrambles down. The royal guard and the loyalists try to push through the people surrounding the table, but it takes them a precious 20 seconds. Lyra watches the melee, her stare cutting through all the bodies and resting upon the crisping scripture. What had she done? Why had she done it? What did she think was going to happen, bringing a book amongst Nephthesians? How did she expect them to react? The Royal Guard finally crashes through the final line of book burners, picking up water pipes that surround the blaze and dumping them upon the lit tabletop. Many of the people in the bar cough and hack, and some try to rush out the door, only to be stopped by the Royal Guards who stand sentry there. Lyra watches on as one guard throws his coat over the damp blaze, squelching the last of the little fires and crumbling the pages of the scripture to dust. Lyra's ears begin ringing, and her 1,000-yard stare does not return to focus. Not as the bar-goers are rounded up and carted off to holding cells. Not during her trial before the diviner, his readers and a jury of Nephthysians. Not when she was invited to a particularly nasty last meal, a death penalty usually reserved for treasonous readers. Not when the poison burned through her body, turning her veins to molten lava. Not even as her vision slowly grayed out on the public dais in front of everyone she had ever known or loved. The vision of the scripture pyre was burnt into her retina, along with the sickening knowledge that she had brought it to the state that it ended up in, a pile of wet, smoldering ash. The diviner and his readers who witnessed her death would be the last of their line, with no scripture to hold the Nephthysian public at bay. The same forces that snatched the scripture from Lyra's grasp, the forces of the people, ran herd over the capital city and executed the diviner. The readers were pardoned in what would be the first of many surprisingly humanitarian acts by the rebel government. Communes and pooling of resources slowly became commonplace on Nephthesia over the next couple hundred cycles of solstice, and eventually the bare bones of scientific theory began to take form. After a few millennia, libraries and schools of higher learning were established. Thousands and thousands of years after her daring escape from the diviner's palace, a statue is erected to the fabled liberator outside the Nephthesia Institute of Planetary Research. The story of a daring soul who had stolen the fabled scripture from the oppressive regime of diviners and allowed the people of the planet to seize freedom for themselves. This story had been passed down from generation to generation, thanks to Lyra's very public execution in front of the planet. Neither her name nor her sex had survived the post-diviner Dark Ages, nor had the barbaric burning of the book, a practice that had gone decidedly out of fashion since the Nephthysian Renaissance. But the story of Lyra the Nepthysian, bold book thief and liberator of the planet, lived on, watching over the universities and schools of thought that had sprung up upon the planet's surface. The soft smile of the faceless, nameless statue watching over the students of Nephthesia looked on solstice after solstice as the knowledge of the planet grew further and further into the stars. Alright everybody, thank you so much for watching. This has been Lyra the Nepthysian, the second in this short story time series. There will be more of these coming down the pike, as well as the story told in series Outpost 19, which will be releasing its first episode in the next week. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, if you like what you hear, please like and subscribe. This has been the Chronicles of Chase.